Okay, good morning again. So it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Ntina Tzouvala to Goldsmiths Law. And what I understand is her first book talk on her brilliant new book, Capitalism as Civilization, A History of International Law, with Cambridge Press. Dina is a senior lecturer in law at the Australian National University. She's also a senior advisor to the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food. Other than her new book, she was also the co-editor of The Extraterritoriality of Law, History, Theory, and Politics with Routledge in 2019. She's also the co-editor of an exciting new volume that should be coming out soon, Revolutions in International Law, The Legacies of 1917 with Cambridge Press. And there's actually so much to be said about Dina's work, but I think it's safe to say that her scholarship is one of the most exciting and, in fact, groundbreaking in current critical legal scholarship, specifically within the Marxist tradition. She focuses in her work on political economy, history, and theory of international law. Dina has written on land grabbing and the post-colonial state, international legal theory, transitional administration, food sovereignty, children's rights, and feminist legal scholarship. Her new book was described by Jessica White as a tour de force of historical and theoretical engagement with international law and its imbrication with capitalism. Robert Knox described the book as a brilliant intervention into debates about the relationship between international law, capitalism, and racism. And Anne Orford said that capitalism as civilization gives voice to a new spirit of revolution in a world on fire. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome Dina. So without further ado, Dina, you have the floor.
Hi, thanks everyone for turning up, and of course thanks to Dr. Maitaha for inviting me. As Mai said, this is indeed my first public book talk, and I'm excited to be doing it at Goldsmiths and with all of you. Also, I don't know if Tom Randall who is attending is the Tom Randall, which is my editor, but if it is my editor, Tom, thank you so much for being so patient while I was asking for extension after extension and making this book happen. Okay, so in a moment I'm going to share my screen, which also will mean I will not be able to see you, and that might also mean if you ever get the sense that I'm talking to myself, it is because I will be talking to myself on my desktop. So I will basically assume that people haven't read the book because there is quite a few stuff going on in the world. So I will give a very broad overview of what this book is about, of the sort of intervention I tried to make within my discipline, and also to an extent political interventions I tried to make. And then, of course, during the Q&A session, if you have more specific questions about the chapters or about methodology or about anything else, I'm more than happy to talk about it. So to begin with, and again, assuming very little knowledge, so sorry if I'm repeating things many of you know, this is a book about the standard of civilization in international law. And the general understanding if you read international law, is like standard textbooks, let's say, of international law, is that the standard of civilization was very important during the 19th and early 20th century, but it was generally, a racist and imperialist thing. And after 1945, it became more or less irrelevant. And of course, the problem with that is that if you open the ICJ statute and you go to Article 31, paragraph 1, subparagraph C, you will see that actually the standard of civilization survived World War II and the UN Charter, because as most of you will know, the ICJ statute names the general principles of law as accepted by the legal systems of civilized states as one of the sources of international law. And it is really interesting to watch the discomfort that this creates when it comes to standard narratives about international law. There is either scholars don't mention that at all, that it says civilized states, or they say, oh, you know, but all states after 1945 are considered civilized states. So it doesn't matter that it says this slightly unsavory thing, because in reality it doesn't really have any doctrinal implications for international law. So this is the standard narrative. Another thing that is pretty standard, I think, both between let's say mainstream and critical takes on international law, is that the standard of civilization established or establishes, depending on where you stand on the divide, a tripartite hierarchy amongst political communities. This was a hierarchy in which on the top you found the so-called civilized states, which included notably European states and white settler states, so notably the United States, but to an extent also Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and in a very hybrid situation, Latin American states. In the middle of the hierarchy, you found the so-called semi-civilized, or you could find them referred to as barbarous states, which included especially East Asian empires, so Japan, China, what was known back in the day as Siam, the Ottoman Empire, Persia. And at the bottom of the hierarchy, you found the so-called uncivilized or savage states that included notably political communities in Africa. And the idea was that political communities enjoyed rights, privileges, carried duties in accordance with the civilizational status they had under international law. So to have full rights and duties, you had to be civilized. If you were semi-civilized, you had some rights, but not the full extent. And basically, as an uncivilized state, the only thing you could do lawfully under international law is basically sign away all your rights, but you couldn't do much else. So this is the general overview of the concept. I just summarized, just 2 minutes ago, I summarized the mainstream view. The most influential critical take on civilization is, of course, that of Tony Anghie, who in his path-breaking Imperialism, Sovereignty and the Making of International Law argued that civilization remains a feature of international law because it is yet another expression of the so-called dynamics of difference that Anghie argues animates international law. So I think that Anghie's argument is extremely valuable, and it has done very important work in showing both, as he said in his own words, that international law is imperialism all the way down, but also in showing, together with other 12 scholars, that civilization did not simply disappear in 1945. And showing that, I think, is a formidable task. And it's a formidable task because if you go on, on Google Books and Ngram and you Google civilization, it is true. And even if you Google it in French, and even if you Google civilisation in German, it is true. It is a fact that the explicit usages of the term in the literature declined sharply, maybe not after 1945, but definitely after the 1960s. So there is an empirical problem if you want to argue that civilization is still relevant for international law. I do think that there is a way around this problem. And I think the way around the problem is the following. I think, and that's what I'm arguing in the book, that we should not approach civilization as a unitary concept that avails itself to specific definition or to, let's say, when it comes to scholars' pursuit, to an intellectual history, but rather it is much more productive to approach it as a style or as a form of arguing about the distribution of rights and duties in international law. And basically, I came to this conclusion because if you think about it, generally international lawyers, or lawyers more broadly, are in the business of arguing rather than in the business of, defining concepts for the purposes of truth, beauty, or whatever. They're in the process of they're in the business of crafting arguments. And even when it appears that we are defining concepts, we are invariably doing so in order to assign legal consequences to these definitions. If I'm right, and if it is better to approach civilization as an argumentative style, then this decline of explicit usage of the word is important, but it's certainly not definitive. This then is a style of arguing. What sort of style of argument is it? Here I'm arguing that as a style of arguing, this is an argument that is both bifurcated and internally unstable. And it is bifurcated and internally unstable between two poles, or two logics, as I call them in the book. On the one hand, you have the logic of improvement, and on the other hand, you have what I call the logic of biology. In a nutshell, the logic of improvement promises to non-Western, non-white majority, non-Christian states, or political communities more accurately, equal inclusion, so equal rights and duties under international law, conditional upon embracing the laws, political structures, political economy, and even aesthetics of capitalist modernity. So basically things like adopting private law, ending up with a centralized and territorially bounded state, having a state that is distinct from society and it is bureaucratized, expanding the realm of law and legislation to cover both domestic social relations, but also international affairs, and also in the process creating the distinction between domestic and international. So that's on the one hand, that's one thing civilization has been doing. But at the same time, there is a certain logic, there is a certain pole. And this is the logic of biology that constantly defers this promise of equal inclusion based on ideas of immutable difference. So basically, rhetorics of race, gender, or childhood are constantly mobilized to say that non-Western political communities cannot have full rights and duties quite yet, because no matter how hard they try to reform themselves, they're always deficient and they're always different, and of course different meaning inferior. So this explains the bifurcation, right? I'm showing that this is a style of argument is constantly, has two facets. How do I mean it though when I say that it is also internally unstable? I mean this, I think, at least in a dual way. So first, I try to show in the book, and especially in the chapter that concerns the 19th century, so chapter 2 for those who might have skimmed through the book, I try to show that many characteristics, many laws, many processes, many state structures that are equated very often with capitalist modernity, upon interrogation turn out to be the culturally specific and historically contingent manifestations of political power in Western Europe, and importantly vice versa. What appears to be like open and unapologetic logic of biology, let's say the flimsy application of anti-slavery when it came to chattel slavery in the southern states of the US, is of course animated by a logic of biology, but at the same time is animated by the indispensable role transatlantic slave trade and slavery played in the development of capitalism around the Atlantic. And you can make, for example, the same arguments about gender and gender talk, right? What appears to be the biologization of women and the inferiority of women can also be read as the indispensable role of women and reproductive labor in the production and reproduction of capitalist relationships of production. So that's one way the standard is unstable. I think there is also a second way, which is the who decides question. So the logic of improvement, in a sense, is a logic that at least nominally is egalitarian, right? If you sign up to certain ways of being, you get admitted to international law. However, the logic of improvement constantly slides into the logic of biology when certain actors, let's say Western international lawyers, assert their exclusive and unilateral authority to impose and assess criteria. So basically, even if I judge you to be my equal, the fact that I decided that it was up to me to set the criteria and to judge them already assumes a certain position of authority and superiority. So this is basically the very core of what I'm arguing in this book. The next question is, why am I arguing this in this book? Or in a sense, what is the disciplinary intervention I try to make in this book? So as a personal story, I wrote a pretty standard Marxist PhD on a very similar topic to that of the book, in which, however, I was arguing, civilization is a concept, it has a meaning, and the meaning is capitalist, right? And a major problem I encountered after I finished the PhD with that is that I basically, at a certain level, just sounded like a left-wing or even a Marxist positivist, in the sense I was treating law as an assemblage of rules, the meaning of which can be determined in an authoritative and straightforward way. And I was just saying, oh, this meaning is bad. And I came to be increasingly frustrated with this tension, at the core of my work. And as a matter of fact, I just literally read again from Apology to Utopia, and I found myself in a really difficult position, which was I didn't have a good argument against it. I didn't have a good argument against the idea that international law is animated by structured legal indeterminacy. And at that stage, I had two choices, right? When admitting that legal indeterminacy is pretty much correct, is a good way of describing argumentative moves in international law, either I had to stop being a Marxist, or I had to figure out how to square these with ideas, for example, of capitalism as a totality, contradictory totality, but totality nonetheless. And I started thinking and reading what is the standard difficulty with Marxist, but also more broadly left-wing and radical reactions to the indeterminacy critique in international law. And the most standard reaction to that is that, and it has been articulated by Chimney, by Rose Parfitt, also in her recent book, is that legal indeterminacy makes it impossible to critique law's complicity with domination and exploitation. If law if law is so plastic and it moves and it slides constantly, how can we say that it does anything in the world? And how can we say that some of the things it does are actually pretty objectionable? The point I landed was that the problem with indeterminacy is not the argument as such, but rather the conclusions that have been drawn from it, either from Martin Koskiniemi himself, or I think more importantly, by other international lawyers. And I think the conclusion that has been drawn was a certain turn to the charismatic authority of the individual lawyer, who, let me say, I think usually is imagined as a white male rational subject, who will be reflexive about the law and will make difficult decisions within this context of legal indeterminacy. So that's the one conclusion that has been drawn. The certain conclusion that has been drawn, I think, and that is specifically in the work of Martin Kosciuszko, is a certain separation between the argument about legal indeterminacy on the one hand and the argument about international law's bias on the other. And those of you who are familiar, Martin Kosciuszko says that the biases of international law are located not so much in its argumentative structures, but rather on different institutions. So if the IMF asserts authority to resolve a certain issue, we pretty much know that it's going to be resolved towards a neoliberal direction, whereas, let's say, if the Human Rights Council asserts successfully authority, is much more likely that it will be resolved towards a mild, I don't know, center-left direction. So I started becoming increasingly uncomfortable with this separation of the argumentative on the one hand and the institutional and biased on the other. And my argument is, the second step of my argument in the book is, what if that it is law's indeterminacy that encapsulates its biases? And the argument, my argument to that extent goes as following. I can extend to that, but I understand capitalists to be, expand on that, sorry. I understand capitalists to be a system of generalized production for exchange and profit that tends to do two things at the same time. And I think the at the same time is very important here. First, it tends to expand in a limitless way, overcoming all limits, borders, and boundaries, and in the process homogenizing space, law, culture, life worlds, and so on. But at the very same time, it expands in unequal, in uneven ways, and in the process, it creates fragmentation, divergence, and stratification. And my argument basically is that this constant slippage between, on the one hand, improvement and on the other hand, biology, incorporates, without being able to resolve, this very basic contradiction of capitalism. So improvement encapsulates the tendency to overcome all borders, and biology encapsulates the tendency to do so in uneven ways. And I'm arguing that international lawyers cannot resolve these slippages and this contradiction for the very reason that the contradictions don't exist simply on a discursive or disciplinary level, but they are reflective in however a mediated way. They're reflected of material relationships of global capitalism and its contradictions. Just to go very, very quickly and give you also, for those who haven't read it, a sense of the book, my argument basically unfolds in 5 substantive chapters. So first, I have the introduction where I deal with methodological issues, and especially with the way I have chosen to approach my legal materials and with what it means to read as a material practice of production. Secondly, I'm dealing with the 19th century, and I'm using as my wedge the so-called unequal treaties and extraterritoriality. Then I move on to the League of Nations, and I especially focus on the emancipation of Iraq under the auspices of the League of Nations. Then I'm looking at the period of decolonization and the Southwest Africa saga, and I'm doing so for 2 reasons. First, because even though, there is this narrative that the standard of civilization collapsed after 1945, the Southwest Africa saga involved as many as 4 or 5 advisory opinions and one contentious case in front of the International Court of Justice, and it was all argued in the idiom of the civilizing mission. And I think especially the discussions of this case can really help us have a way into the concept, or into the argument rather. But I'm also dealing with the Southwest Africa saga because I think it's a cautionary tale for contemporary progressive international lawyers. And I'm happy to expand on this, but basically my argument is that the Ethiopia and Liberia and their lawyers try to use the sacred trust of civilization against the grain. They tried to use it for anti-imperialist and even partially for anti-capitalist purposes, but they got trapped themselves within the argumentative oscillations that they had to perform. And in a sense, it is a cautionary tale about, I think, the impossibility of using any version of civilization as a wedge of emancipatory or progressive demands in international law. And finally, I'm turning my eye to the war on terror and the survival and reconfiguration of civilizational arguments in international law, in especially focusing on the occupation of Iraq, and that also creates a symmetry with Chapter 2, and also with the so-called unwilling or unable doctrine on the international law on the use of force. And I think on that note, I might stop sharing my screen. Have I stopped sharing my screen?
No.
No. Okay. Okay. Now? No. Sorry, it's the first time I'm using yeah, it's the first time I'm using Google Teams. So yeah, I think I have now. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. And I'm looking forward to answering your questions.
Thank you so much, Dina. This was great. I'm sure everyone is really looking forward to reading the book. So what I would do, I'll ask kind of a quick question while people kind of prepare their questions.
Sure.
So if you have a question, please raise your hand or write in the chat. You could also write a number in the chat, so 1, 2, 3. And yeah, let me open the chat box. Okay, perfect. So thank you again. So I have a question that's kind of open-ended a little bit. So you clearly explain this brilliantly structured argument on how civilization is not simply a unitary concept that is stable and static, but that it is a mode of argumentation that oscillates between those two logics of improvement and that of biology. And I was wondering, okay, so this is the side of international law, and perhaps maybe this is a conversation that's not necessarily, that's outside of the book, but the book provokes perhaps, is that what other notions of the international can we imagine that are not stuck within these logics of biology and improvement within civilization, that international law with its liberal internationalist history forces us into this space. And I'm thinking that specifically with, you know, in light of your Marxist backgrounds and specifically on conversations around agency and revolution, speaking of the upcoming book as well. So if you can, you know, say a few words about that, that would be great. I already see a few questions. Would you like to answer that or take a few more questions?
Yeah, I would love to. So thank you for this. So here's the thing, and it's a clarification maybe I should have made earlier. One of the concessions I make is that I think civilization is one argumentative pattern among many in international law. So I'm not claiming this to be an exhaustive theory of the international legal argument. It's an international legal argument. I think it's more important than we realize necessarily, but I think it's one. And in a sense, I'm not making any, the book is agnostic. I'm not necessarily myself, but the book is agnostic about other arguments and the way that can or cannot be used for progressive or even like radical purposes, right? So the book does not pronounce on that. I do pronounce on civilization. I do think that efforts to appropriate it for progressive purposes are disastrous, but I'm not making broader arguments. And I do think if we, I mean, partly I could tell you, you know, there is internationalisms that have nothing to do with law, right? The internationalism of Black Lives Matter in solidarity with Palestine is not an internationalism that is specifically or especially anchored to law. But I think there is also space to make these arguments outside of, you know, civilization, right? And I'm thinking, for example, let's say if one reads the reports Tendaya Chume has been writing as UN Special Rapporteur on Racism and Xenophobia, are reports that I think are very much breaking with liberal understandings, both of international law, but also of like race and racism, right? She understands race and racism very much so as a material relationship of domination, dispossession, and exploitation, right? How widespread and successful these experiments will be, I don't know, and I don't think it will be judged on disciplinary grounds. I think like it will be judged on political grounds, right? And if like the movement is strong, suddenly these arguments will start resonating, and if the movement is weak, these arguments will not go anywhere. But in a sense, yeah, my argument is quite limited in the sense that I'm picking up one pattern of argument, and people can like make up their minds about the rest.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to read a few questions from the chat, and you can kind of take your order. So there's a question from Bogdan saying, thank you very much for interesting presentation. As someone whose main interest is in international economic law, I was wondering how you would see your analysis applied to international investment law.
Yeah.
Which I understand you've also worked on that. Another question is how, in your two logics, the systemic bias fits in, if it does, of course, in your construction. I think is it in reference to the structural bias in Koskiniemi, maybe? I'm not sure. And there's another question from Natalie, who says, my question is whether and how the understanding you have developed in this book plays into your practical work, for instance, in your advisory role to the Special Rapporteur. And maybe answer those questions, and then there's another question.
Yeah, so about international investment law. So when I was trying to figure out what the final chapter of the book would be, I was between the war on terror and international investment law. And I get this question so often that I'm like, did I make a mistake? Should I have gone for international investment law? So I think international investment law enacts this logic or this pendulum in a number of ways. And I think it enacts it, on the one hand, I think international investment law interpolates the state specifically, not just as a capitalist state, but as a neoliberal state. So it's not enough to generally be, you know, a capitalist Keynesian state. You have to be specifically neoliberal. And international investment law, in a sense, says you can have even interventions in the economy and in the market, but these interventions, to an extent, like they have to be market creating and sustaining rather than limiting competition. So in a sense, the logic of improvement there is that if you transform your state along very narrow neoliberal visions of, let's say, the rule of law or of good governance or whatever, then of course you can regulate, right? And on the other hand, I think it enacts the logic of biology in ways that, like, I think it's really interesting to see it, first because it's disproportionately against global South states, right? So that's in itself an indication of the continuation of the hierarchy. But also, if you go and read, so lately I've been reading a lot the von Pezzold Award against Zimbabwe, for those who know. And basically the idea is of Zimbabwe, and especially of Black Zimbabweans, as like always ready to slip into anarchy and chaos and violence and disorderly conduct. And the white, so there is this beautiful passage in the von Pezzold case in which the court is figuring out whether it will give the white investor moral damages for the violence during the occupations of their farms and the expropriation. And they're saying, well, yeah, we only have the testimony of the white investor, but like, what else would we want? Like, who is better to tell us about his suffering than himself? And I'm like, that's a great way of approaching burden of proof in international law. It would be great if we applied it in sexual assault cases. So a certain valuation of whiteness that is sometimes extraordinarily explicit. And I think it's shocking sometimes how explicit the valuation of whiteness as trustworthiness is in international investment law, as trustworthiness, as productivity, as contribution to development, and so on and so forth. I think it's obviously in much more mediated forms than 19th century openly racist discourse, but I think it's there. I think the moral damages section of the von Pezzold Award is one of the most insane things I've ever read. So, and of course we could have other examples too, right? So I hope like that's useful as a starter. About Aliki's questions about the systemic bias, which will also understand to mean the structural bias. So in a sense, my argument there is that it is a form of laws, international law, systemic bias, the fact that first it demands capitalist transformation, and at the same time it always reenacts racism and misogyny and whatever, but also the fact that it constantly oscillates is a fact. Maybe don't call it bias, but of its systemic entanglement with the contradictions of global capitalism. You don't have to call it bias, because I think also bias as a word draws too much from liberal epistemology that assumes that there is something that is not biased, or that bias is a failure. But you can call it systematic entanglement. You can find another way of expressing it. And I think it's both the two poles, but it's also the instability that is part of the systematic entanglement, because I think in the better renditions of Marxism, capitalism is a totality, but it's a contradictory totality. And that's a very big part of the Marxian critique, or I think of what I think is the interesting version of Marxian critique of capitalism. It's a totality. So it has, let's say, laws these days sounds a bit simplistic. It has patterns, or it has tendencies, but many of these tendencies actually pull in different directions. And capitalism, the typical Marxian argument goes, and I agree with it, cannot resolve these contradictions endogenously. International law and law tries to solve some of these contradictions, but it cannot, because it's always already in there. I think I've totally forgotten the third question, and that's not a reflection on the question, it's a reflection on me.
I'll go. I also missed another important question that follows.
Yes.
Which follows nicely actually on the question is from John Monroe, saying your thinking and rethinking of what of and with Marxism is so generative, and I hope you could say more about what the category of civilization does for the classic base and superstructure theoretical metaphor.
Yeah. So first I'll respond to Natalie's question about the practical work. So yeah, I think the one thing it does, my argument is yet to, like, I think it does make civilization arguments unavailable. I think it does say that, you know, you can try in a sense to play the game and be like, we are good students of capitalism or we are good students of neoliberalism, but you're always precariously included. So like, I do try not to make arguments based on civilization. On the other hand, I think this sort of argument is relatively agnostic, as I was telling to my about other arguments, and I think it's relatively and pleasantly agnostic about very tactical and even very cynical deployments of international legality. If people want to make international law arguments and they think it's helping their cause without undermining, you know, long-term strategy, and I'm thinking here of the work of Rob Knox, who's drawing from Lenin, is talking about, you know, strategy and tactics in international law and using international law in tactical ways that don't undermine your strategic vision of comprehensive human liberation. And I mean, in a sense, this is not a question that can be resolved on a theoretical level. In a sense, that's a question that can only be resolved on a case by case and in a praxis level. And I'm hoping I'm not doing a terrible job myself in doing it. And I think it's also resolved by, like, I don't know, talking to your comrades and remaining somehow grounded. So like Michael Fakri, who's the special rapporteur, he's been doing a terrific job in remaining grounded in communities of struggle, right? Remaining grounded in peasant rights movement and also bringing the labor movement into the food conversation. This is not a foolproof, you know, guarantee against anything, but I think it's a first useful step. John and basis superstructure. Yeah, I mean, I don't use it, the base superstructure thing. I think it's, you know, it's a visual metaphor, it's a topographical metaphor that does something, you know, as a primer, but it's not a helpful. I don't think it's a helpful way of thinking. Especially.
Dina, I think you froze for a minute.
Oh,
can you?
am I back?
I think, yeah, you're back. Yeah, there you go.
Oh, wait, I'm not sure where I froze. Did I froze?
Just a few seconds, so you can continue.
Sure. Yeah. So I was saying that, like, I do find the work of Althusser quite generative, and the idea that what we call superstructure is actually essential for the reproduction of the capitalist mode of production, right? And there is no production without reproduction. I do think that at the same time, what my thinking about civilization does a bit is to push back against it, a certain critical reflex in international law and in law more generally, that in the process of saying that international law matters and is important and it does bad things in the world and we should pay attention, it ends up reifying law far too much. And it ends up basically saying that law somehow is the engine that moves history. And in that sense, yeah, I do remain quite firmly within the Marxist tradition. I don't think law moves history, right? I think only lawyers would ever entertain such a bizarre idea. So in a sense, what I do try to do is a bit that, and in a sense, I am trying to say that law is world-making and generative as much as it is fragile and impotent, because at the end of the day, it cannot solve these contradictions. At the end of the day, it is always extremely contradictory and it doesn't make much sense if you look too closely. So I hope that answers John's question.
Great. There's a number of other questions. Okay, so a question from Nicole, who has already started reading your book and wanted you to think about or revisit the concept of biology. I understand you use it to describe that capitalism structurally causes inequalities. Could you elaborate the choice of the term? Why do you call it biology? Yeah, that's it.
That's a great question.
Yeah, let me take a few others so that we don't. Wow, there are many. I was wondering how, this is from Farhan, I was wondering how your framework of analysis may relate to current legal discourses on business and human rights. And another question on, so yeah, that's a clarification. So why don't you take those questions and we have a few more.
Thank you. So the logic of biology. So the way I use the logic of biology is the following, and I think Jess White in her review took on my use, and I think she's right. So I also want to say that it has its limitations. So I'm using the logic of biology to basically summarize quite crudely the persistence of a discourse of constant stratification, differentiation, and hierarchy within international law. This can be race, it can be gender, and as I said before, it can be childhood. So basically saying, racializing states, or gendering, especially feminizing or hyper-masculinizing states, or saying that certain states and certain political communities are children. So in a sense, biology, the logic of biology tries to capture a tendency within international legal argumentation, and I think it's also within political theory and within other things, of assuming some form of immutable difference. This doesn't mean that this assumption of immutable difference has to always be anchored on full-on 19th century biological racism, like Gobineau style, right? That literally he will categorize races one after the other and like put them all in, in order based from the more superior to the less superior. And in that sense also, that's the limit of using the word biology, right? You could say the logic of immutable difference, but it partly sounds less catchy. So I went with the logic of biology. But also I did go for logic of biology because, and that's my political concern, I think even in the 1990s, this immutable difference had become heavily culturalized. It was these people's culture that made them different. I think now the full-on biological racism and stratification is making a return. So in a sense, I used it partly because it's catchy, or catchier than the logic of immutable difference. But also I used it to draw attention to the fact that these ideas have not gone away, including in the international legal argument. I think they still exist, and they always did, but a bit like an undercurrent. And I think they're surfacing again, even after a new president got inaugurated in the US. Like, probably racism is not over. So that was what I was trying to do with the logic of biology. But of course, as I said before, Jess White, I think she made a useful criticism in saying that, it is a crude way of putting together a number of ideologies and discourses, and also a number of material practices that are quite diverse. And I think that's a very fair enough criticism. Sorry, I always forget the next question.
The other question was on sorry?
Business and human rights, was it?
On business and human rights.
Yeah. So I have to say that I'm very unfamiliar with the literature, right? So that I think structures my whole response. But I do think partly the business and human rights discourse assumes two things. The first is that human rights will counter the bad or harmful or exploitative practices of businesses, both as a matter of fact, so that they are effective, but also as a matter of theory. And a very interesting thing, I think Sylvia Staniger has written a stunning article about this in the Leiden Journal of International Law, which is in investment arbitration, human rights claims that are successful are by majority raised by the investors themselves. So it's the investors who have human rights in international law rather than the disenfranchised communities. So that's one thing. So like, in the my further argument there is not to think that human rights, because good people generally do it, or well-intentioned people you do it, are necessarily immune to the pattern of argument I just outlined. I think they're not. And I think especially when in the 1990s human rights was a much more hegemonic discourse than maybe now. I think you can see
this book just came out. That
correct. I think someone is catching someone up on your talk, but I think they're muted now. Sorry, go ahead.
No, of course. So I think it is useful to be in the business, let's say in the business of human rights space, to be mindful of the fact that the field is really not immune to this type of argument, right? The argument that says only certain types of states that adopt a very narrow, not even liberal, but like specifically neoliberal understanding of human rights are deserving of full rights under international law, and at the same time to constantly defer this inclusion based on tropes of like excessive violence and irrationality and whatever. So, but at the same time, as I said, my knowledge of the literature is abysmally bad.
Okay, so we have a final question, and I have another final question if I can. But a question is from Michael, who's asking, to what extent does your book engage with the argument that neoliberalism privileges certain categories of human rights, civil and political, and downgrades or sidelines others like economic and social rights? How does your theory of civilizational standards link up with this idea? Are international human rights captured by an ethos of capitalism, and to what consequence?
Thank you, Michael. So my book does not engage with that at all, because as I said in the final chapter where I deal with neoliberalism, I do it by way of discussing the laws of occupation and also international law on the use of force. So I don't really deal with these. My sense of the field is that I think there is some truth, there's definitely truth in saying that neoliberalism privileges some rights over others, but I think neoliberalism, as all hegemonic ideologies, downgrade as much as reinterprets, right? So like socioeconomic rights can and have been reinterpreted in ways that, in my understanding, are pretty consistent with neoliberal ethos and governance and so on and so forth. How could my argument help us think especially about social and economic rights? I haven't quite thought through, but I think it could help us understand, especially the logic of improvement, the particular iteration of capitalist state that has become acceptable, the only acceptable form of political community in international law. And I think this perhaps could be a very useful starting point in maybe start thinking also how this transformation of the acceptable state, not just as a capitalist state, but as a neoliberal capitalist state, has had also effects on the way we think about economic and social rights, and also the way we think about, social equality, inclusion, liberation, whatever, through the idiom of rights in the first place, right? The fact that that's the idiom that, at least for a very long time, seemed to be the only one available to us to think about economic inclusion, I think it's not unrelated to the rise of neoliberalism. And of course, Jess White's book from last year, I think, does some of this work without necessarily, even though she does have a chapter on civilization and neoliberal thought herself, but I think she's the one who has done this work with great care, and it's really worth engaging with.
Thank you. I have a final question. I don't see other questions in the chat. And it's sort of maybe an expected question, specifically as to someone like you who obviously borrows and from the Marxist tradition, or actually you placed yourself within the Marxist tradition. And within Marxist legal theory, many people have invoked Pasher-Kani's, most notably, obviously, China Miéville and Robert Knox, as you know, and the argument around the fact that the legal form under capitalism takes the commodity form. And I understand that you depart a little bit from that. And I was wondering if you want to say a few words about this.
Sure. So, yeah, I mean, that's very detailed Marxology, but I think like Rob Knox's iteration of Pasher-Kani is much more interesting, and I think much more layered than China Miéville's. So that's a thing to bracket my answer with. I feel I'm both agnostic and somewhat uninterested towards the commodity theory of law. And I'm agnostic and uninterested because it's the sort of thing that sounds to me like it could or could not be right. But I don't know how much it helps us understand law as an argumentative practice. I think it can slide very easily into thinking about law as rules, right? And these rules have some sort of definitive content, and this content is reflective of some sort of primordial commodity owner, right? So that is one thing, and I think it can end up sliding to the form of left wing of Marxist positivism I started from. So that is my point. And my second point is, as I was telling you in the beginning, I did not try to create a Marxist theory of international law. I tried to create a Marxist theory of one argumentative pattern of international law. It doesn't mean that I don't think this sort of comprehensive theorizing is impossible, or I think it's unwanted, but it's not something I felt that I could do, and at the same time keep track of the texture and of the contradiction that I came to see in international legal argument. I think it is possible, and I think it is desirable and necessary, but I think it would be some sort of synthesis of a number of other contradictory argumentative patterns, including civilization, rather than the reflection of some sort of like originary figure that is the commodity holder. So that's where I have come out. At the same time, I have to say that like Robert Knox partly understands his work as work that is Pasher-Kanian, and at the same time is within the indeterminacy critique. So I have to say that, like, there is people who work within this tradition, and they do think that they can be held together. So that, like, just to give people a better sense of the field.
Thank you. This has been really, really great. I'm so happy that we were lucky at Goldsmiths to have you as the first, the debut of the book. So thank you so much for that. And it sucks that we won't be able to go for drinks after. But at least we can go back to the Bernie memes from last night. But anyway, hopefully sometime in the future we'll be able to have you in person and actually do that. But thank you so much. And sorry to keep you late. I know it's very late in Sydney right now. So thanks for waking up. And thank you everyone for attending. We probably will be sharing the recording soon. Hopefully, we'll see.
Thank you to everyone who turned up, and thanks to you, Mai, for organizing.
Great. Thanks. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.